Welcome to the Think For Yourself Clubhouse. I am Bill Martin and my co-host is Dennis Reinhart. Our guest today is Tom Yeager, who is an enthusiastic Democrat from Scioto County. We're going to talk today about a document Tom calls the Democratic Creed. It is an effort to answer the question, what do Democrats believe in? It's short enough that Tom has asked if he can just start out reading it all the way through, and that's where we'll go after we're finished with the intro here. I do want to point out that we are in the midst of the Jackson County Apple Festival just outside the studio doors, so if you hear any sound coming in from the outside, it might be Jackson County Apple Festival. By the way, the Jackson County Democrats who have set up a booth at the Apple Festival have taken the Democratic Creed as their theme this year, and that's what we're going to talk about, is the Democratic Creed. What is it that Democrats believe in? Tom's bio brought up to me this morning. I'll read it. Thomas Yeager is originally from Los Angeles, California, where he was born and raised. He left L.A. at the age of 20 when he joined the U.S. Air Force. He served for 25 years, retiring as a senior master sergeant in 2005. So Tom is a career Air Force man. Upon retirement, he joined his wife, Rhonda, who was also retired from the U.S. Air Force in Lucasville, Ohio. He fully retired in 2023 after 9 years as an IT manager at the Chillicothe Veterans Affairs Medical Center. He became politically active during Barack Obama's first campaign for president, as did Aggie and I. He stepped away from politics after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, but was asked to return several years ago by the new Scioto County Democratic Party chair and has been passionately involved since then. He is currently serving as a precinct captain, was recently elected as a regional vice chair of the Ohio Democratic Party's Rural Caucus, and is the executive director of the nonprofit group Democrats 101, which promotes the ideas put forth in the book of the same name. Democrats 101, a primer for us, is a reminder to Democrats of their history, where they came from, and who they are. Written by Jim Purvis, it also introduces the Democratic Creed, a statement of Democratic Party beliefs and values. Tom, you had asked if you could just read the Creed through to get us started, so go ahead.
Certainly. Now, mind you, the Creed was written by about eight Democrats, including Amy McGrath, who ran against Mitch McConnell during his last election. So it wasn't just one author doing the Creed. So we believe all people are created equal, that this is America's fundamental ideal. We believe that America is a democracy by and for the people, ruled by the Constitution and its interpretations, protected by the Bill of Rights, and inspired by the Declaration of Independence. We believe these founding documents demand freedom, justice, and opportunity for all Americans in full and equal measure, regardless of who you are, what you believe, or where you live. We believe that the duty of government is to strive endlessly to make the ideals of freedom, justice, and opportunity a reality for all. We believe that the purpose of government is to protect our nation, defend our democracy, and to endlessly promote the welfare of each and every one of us. And we believe that fighting for these ideals is our purpose as a political party. Thank you.
Good. Why is it important to have principles written? My view is, and Dennis, feel free to kick in when you like here, that we're subject to some criticism. The Democrats are all over the place. They don't know what they believe. You got your righties, you got your lefties, you got your centrists. Mm-hmm. And part of what you're saying, as I understand it, is let's figure out what we believe in and kind of get back to that a little bit.
Well, absolutely. The issue is that no one ever put down into writing what Democrats actually believe, what our values are. You often, if you ask a Democrat what do they believe in, they're liable to give you a policy. We believe in health care for all. But our policies need to be founded in our root beliefs. So if we say we need we want health care for all, we can tie those into the creed, because health care for all gives people the opportunity to be able to move from job to job if they need to without worrying about losing their health care. It gives people the opportunity, well, that's both freedom and opportunity. It gives them the freedom to move, and they can take any opportunities that come to them. So that's just one example. We can tie pretty much any policy that the Democrats are for to some aspect of the Democratic creed. Because if you don't know what you believe in, how are you going to justify your policies?
Okay. I noticed in this creed, early on, it says, ruled by the Constitution. You use the word rule there. Rule means somebody telling somebody else how to behave. And I believe a lot of this creed is we live under the rule of law.
Absolutely.
And that's one of our core beliefs.
Well, the Constitution is the basis for all of our laws, so yes.
The creed goes on to say that, there's some explanatory material that goes with it. We noticed that as well. Justice means a society where every individual is treated equally before the law and by the law. I'd like to call your attention to an incident recently. I want to explore this idea of rule by law and rule of law. Call your attention to an incident recently where the United States military purposely blew up a boat from Venezuela and killed all 11 people on board. President Trump ordered the hit, and his excuse was that the boat was carrying drugs into the United States. Tom, you're familiar with the military apparatus in this country, having been an Air Force professional. Was the Coast Guard capable of intercepting that boat if it entered our territorial waters?
Absolutely. And since they knew where the boat was, we know that it was being monitored. We don't know for sure that it had any drugs on it because it was blown up. But the Coast Guard's, one of its main missions is to defend our coastline, and that includes interdiction of any sort of smugglers trying to come to our shores carrying anything. Drugs is the main thing people worry about, but the Coast Guard is well trained and well equipped to perform those types of interdiction.
There was some reporting, I believe, that the boat had noticed that there was a plane, aircraft above, and they'd turned around and tried to hightail it for home, and they were blown up anyway. So I don't think they were much of a threat from that perspective. I compare it to a situation, I've had some experience in county government as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, and 6 years as a judge. I compare it to a situation where police officers are conducting a controlled buy of illegal drugs, and undercover agent purchases the drugs from the seller. Now, if it's a controlled buy, this is all under observation. After the exchange, money for drugs, the police are supposed to arrest the drug seller. And my question is, what if instead the supervising police officer on the controlled buy asks the National Guardsman who's standing nearby under Trump's orders to lift his rifle and shoot the drug seller dead? Would that be legal, or would it be murder?
That would be murder, as was, in my opinion, what happened to the 11 on that boat. President Trump has been granted immunity for what he does in office, but that immunity doesn't extend to anyone else. This actually is one of those cases that demands justice that probably won't happen unless Democrats are able to get back into power, and that justice demands the accountability of the chain of command that gave the order to fire upon that boat, all the way down to the pilot that pulled the trigger.
The military is built upon the principle that you follow orders. Is there a qualification to that directive?
Yeah, there certainly is. You are not to follow illegal orders. And U.S. military firing on a boat in international waters would be an illegal order. They do not have, other than a possibility or an idea, they have absolutely no reason to fire on a boat like that. It has absolutely no danger to the United States. It's in international waters, which gives it, which any boat is free to travel in. So it was the duty of every level of supervision to say no to that order, all the way down to the pilot that pulled the trigger.
I remember decades ago when I spent a couple of years in Uncle Sam's Army. My training always was, and from the get-go, it was you shall obey lawful orders. Now the emphasis was on shall, but there was always that qualification. The order has to be lawful, and if it is, you have to obey it. In this case, it was clearly an unlawful order. About as clear a case of, in my opinion, purposeful homicide or murder as you're going to find, especially because there was the clear alternative of doing what you're supposed to do, which is intercept the boat when it reaches your waters, get on the boat, search it if you need to, but killing people?
Yeah, it's, I think what people miss, the point is, they're just saying, well, they're drug runners, they're bringing in fentanyl, they're bringing in all of this, we don't know that. But irregardless of that, the way our legal system is supposed to work is, you talk about the Coast Guard stopping and they're searching. Evidently, they find evidence that they may have been transporting drugs. Those people deserve the right to due process. They deserve the right to be in a trial, to speak in their defense. And if the evidence shows and the jury decides that they were guilty of something illegal, then whatever the punishment is for that, then they'll serve that punishment. But drug smuggling is not a capital offense. That's what people have to understand. There is no death penalty for drug smuggling. And we have a situation of someone acting as judge, jury, and executioner without benefit of trial. And that goes against anything that we have as our values as Americans, I think.
There's another aspect to this, and that is, I think if people see it in a video game, it doesn't seem like it's real. And what Trump did here was he posted his video of this incident so that everybody could see it. And it's as if it's not real. Viewers, 11 people died, and as I understand it, he did it again several days later, and another 3 people died in another incident. This is not normal. Just because it falls out of the news cycle, it's still there, and we should pay close attention to what's going on in this country.
One last thing. Such orders put the military member in a very difficult position because the military member out there doesn't have legal representation to turn to in the heat of the moment to say, hey, is this legal? Can I do this? So they have to make a choice. If they say no and they don't do it, there's a good chance that they're going to find themselves facing military punishment. But if they say yes, and they pull that trigger, then down the road, they may find themselves being tried for it. Because we like to say, and whether or not it'll turn out to be true or not, is that I was just following orders has never been an acceptable excuse for committing atrocities such as this.
And we talked about, I think, before that the American military is probably one of the few militaries that has to undergo some sort of ethics training or education. I know that a friend of mine, who's a Green Beret officer in Vietnam, we talked about it, and he just said, that we had to undergo ethics. The Soviets didn't have to undergo any type of ethics training. And I mean, I don't know how far that extends down through the ranks. How far does that? Is that just mainly the officers?
No, it's all the way down. You get it all the way.
I was about as low as you could get. I was ESIP in 1969. They gave me that training. Yeah. So it's lawful orders. Trump, on the other hand, at one point commented that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and he could get away with it. And now that he's the chief executive officer of the Supreme Court, in its infamous immunity decision confirmed that in this case he could indeed get away with murder. We saw the boat incident. We saw it happen. It happened at least twice. Okay, so that's rule of law. Democrats stand for the rule of law. I would hope Republicans do also. Tom, the Republican Party spends a lot of time arguing that the Democrats are a bunch of socialists, and here's what the creed or supporting material says about the economy. It says, the American democracy depends upon an economy based on free enterprise and fair markets, protected by the government from the greed of large corporations and the financially powerful. I think there's a balance between an economy that has no government regulation at all and a government that stifles all creativity and enterprise. The creed proposes two measuring sticks for the economy. It says every American deserves to know that they will not be hungry or homeless or lack medical care. These things are America's moral duty to share. Every American deserves to live in a healthy environment that includes clean air, clean water, and safe food. So one of the things that the creed apparently is taking on is the responsibility of the government to assure certain life qualities that people should enjoy, such as health care, something to eat when you're hungry, and I would hope some assurance that you won't be homeless and on the street. Furthermore, the creed says that all Americans deserve to live in an environment with clean air and clean water. I'm thinking about, for example, the city of Pittsburgh. When I was growing up, it was infamous for having smog so thick that you got sick just living there. Beautiful city now. And the reason for that is regulation. So although there may be some regulations that are burdensome, there are other regulations, I think, that are necessary. What do you guys think?
Well, one of the problems we have run into is that a lot of times regulations get added on top of regulations, and that layered effect can make things very burdensome. But the reality is that only the federal government is in a position to make the laws and the regulations that would apply nationwide that would protect our air and our water, and our land from pollution, and to be able to stop people or stop corporations from polluting them. This is important because usually taking the steps to prevent the pollution from your manufacturing plant, which is where a lot of it comes from, it costs the corporations money, and they would rather that money go into profits. So if they have the opportunity to get the government to roll back or ignore those regulations, they take it and they push for that. The other thing is that there are people that say, as far as the people that are unhoused and the hungry and such, that it should be not the government's responsibility, but say that of churches. There's not a church out there that would be able to take on that role. Even all of the churches in the United States would not be able to take on the role of providing for the people in need in this nation, especially now when we've pretty much lost most of the middle class. So the government, we're the richest nation on earth. Why we have people living on the streets, children going hungry, and people dying because they can't afford health care is strictly due to policy decisions made by our government. If we chose, we could tax the very rich the way they should be. We could protect Social Security by lifting the cap on how much you make and when it comes to how much you pay into Social Security. But all these rules are in there to protect the very rich and the corporations. And we need to remember that this is a government by and for the people, not the corporations or a select few.
Going back to regulation, regulation I think should always be determined, is it helping the greatest number of people? Is it protecting the greatest number of people? Because if we're getting rid of regulations to benefit a few people who want to capitalize on the profits that they can make on that, but yet this is harmful to the greatest number of people, that should always be the way we consider regulation. I go back to a few years ago, and this was a political conflict between corporate farmers and farmers in northwestern Ohio who were using fertilizers, phosphate fertilizers, that was draining into Lake Erie. It was creating huge algal blooms, which actually affected the water supply of Toledo, Ohio, and they had to shut that down. But yet you've got this opposition in the government to regulate the things that are actually making somebody's water supply toxic. Now who should the government side with? If it is that government for the people, then it should decide for the greatest number of people to protect those people. And I think we can all agree on that. That's the way it should be. But we've got an imbalance right now, and there is too much influence the other way to get rid of the regulations, so profits can be increased for a few people, even at the expense of the majority of us.
Yeah, it's clear, and I think we probably admit that a government regulation to assist the environment is going to cost the company money.
Yes.
It simply is. And the decision we've made up to now, at least in many cases, is that's the cost that should be borne.
Yes.
And of course, everybody knows that cost is going to ultimately be passed on to the consumer. The company, of course, would like to save the money so they could probably enhance their executive salaries. I think they could afford to reduce their executive salaries a bit, enhance their pollution controls a bit, and everybody would be better off, including the people. We've noticed recently, Tom, that Trump has eliminated the EPA requirement that coal-fired plants report emission levels. What's that all about?
Well, again, that's about saving the power companies money. If they don't have to report their emission levels, then they don't have to put in the ongoing cost of maintaining the equipment that minimizes those emissions. Or if we're not building new coal power plants, but if they were, then they just won't put them in at all. If they don't have to report on the emissions and admit what they're doing, they are not going to willingly take the steps to keep the emissions low.
History teaches us, does it not, that the only way the pollution-emitting corporation is going to cut their pollution is if they're required to do so.
Yeah,
they don't do it voluntarily.
No, they don't.
They don't spend that money voluntarily.
They do not.
The tobacco companies didn't spend that money voluntarily, didn't cut back on tobacco ads. Now then, with respect to taxation, it seems to me that probably ought to tax where the money is.
I agree.
And where's the money these days?
And money is in basically a handful of people at the very top. Ever since the Reagan years, that trickle-down theory of economics, we have learned that it absolutely does not work. We've learned that time and time again. What happens instead of, they have that picture of a bunch of glasses and the top one's being filled and then it overflows and it fills the glasses behind it. That's not what happens. That top glass just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the ones below get nothing. And that's what's happening now. So we need to tax the corporations and tax the very rich fairly. And by fairly, that means tax them at least as much as they're taxing us. But one of the things that amuses me is that when you hear people talk about making America great again, a lot of times they're thinking about the boom years after World War II. Well, the tax rates for the very rich and for corporations were extremely high during those times, up to about 90% in some cases.
Yeah, I looked that up. It was 92%. Now, there were lots of loopholes.
Yeah, that's what I was
that
going to
they used
say.
to trim that
yeah,
back.
they didn't pay that 90%.
But they still paid more back
Yes,
then
yes.
than they do now.
Exactly.
But as you're pointing out with this creed, that the principle is that the American people should be adequately clothed, should be adequately fed, should be adequately housed, should have adequate medical care. And the technique or the policy you would do that would be to tax, raise money where the money is. Rich people, rich corporations. To me, that's pretty simple. And I think you're seeing just the opposite coming into effect now with the Republican Party.
One of the hardest things, I think, is, you go back to the power plants, and of course that relates to things like coal mining, is that, the human, when they make decisions, they're not taking into account the effects on the human level of it. And if you look at areas in West Virginia and southwest West Virginia and down in McDowell County and places like that, the loss of the coal industry was devastating. Coal was on its way out. It's on its way out, but it was devastating. I counted like 200 abandoned houses one time driving through there, and the poverty levels are just, I think government has an obligation also, if they make a decision that is going to affect the livelihoods of people, they also have an obligation to do something about that, to try to help that area economically. That they
retraining programs.
That they should go out of their way to do that, and it doesn't seem like we've done that. You just can't abandon people, and I think that it should be a responsibility of government. If you're going to make those changes, you need to look ahead on down the line, and how is that going to affect the entire population of people?
Yeah, when I was a kid in Jackson, growing up in Jackson, teenager, I think it was, the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's programs. Well, one of those programs was an enterprise they called Manpower Training Plan, and to this day we have a park in Jackson called the Manpower Park. Well, the reason for that is that's where the Manpower Training Center was located. People learned welding, learned practical jobs. This is what you're talking about. If people need to be retrained, Appalachian, Ohio, people need to be retrained, then that can be done. There's no reason not to do that, and that was an enterprise led by the federal government. And Johnson should get the credit for that. There's some things he did that he didn't get credit for, but he should be given credit for that sort of what he called Great Society. Tom, you had a comment.
And along with that, education, whether it be through a 4-year university or through trade schools, should not cost what it's costing people right now. In fact, I would argue that, like other first world countries, it ought to be free to the people. And the reason for that is we need to invest in our future. And if we invest our future, that means giving people the opportunity to be able to go to school and learn a trade in the trades, or learn go through the coursework to become a lawyer or a doctor or something along those lines. Now, there's an argument to be made, well, up to a 4-year degree, and then after that you're on your own. But a nation is not going to thrive if just going to school puts an unreasonable burden on the people. And it prevents those that do not have the means to pay for that from going to school or going to trade school at all.
Well, I don't know if paying for college is perhaps too big a bite, but certainly they can pay for high school, and they're not even doing that.
Well, unfortunately,
in Jackson County, in the city of Jackson, the school district is being strangled, and it happens in rural Ohio generally.
And unfortunately, as we've all learned, your education levels, or the quality of your education, is based on your zip code, where you live. And I learned that when I was in high school, and I saw a perfect example of that. I lived in a suburb of Los Angeles called Southgate. And in high school, I was on the team that filmed the football games, the junior varsity and the varsity. And to do that, we had, in the late 70s or mid 70s, we had an old wind-up 16 millimeter black and white camera for the junior varsity, and a Super 8 camera that actually had a zoom on it for the varsity. Well, we were playing Beverly Hills, and up above us, sticking out of a window,
Beverly Hills?
the Beverly Hills. And up above us, sticking out of the end of one of their buildings, about 3 floors up, was a videotape camera. And mind you, this was the 70s. Videotape cameras were extraordinarily expensive. And in conversation with them, we learned that not only was it a videotape camera, but it was a color videotape camera, which was even more expensive. And this one had the number 4 on it, which meant they had at least 4 of those cameras. So that told me right there that if you live in a neighborhood where the people are wealthy, then your school is going to have the resources to provide what they need to be able to provide you with a good education. If you live in a neighborhood that is poor, that school is going to struggle because all too often it's based on local property values. And if you're talking about that, of course it's going to be a discrepancy there.
Yeah, if you're defunding education, whether it's higher level education or elementary or secondary, what you're basically doing is defunding the future of this nation, the future of this community, the future of Ohio is what you're doing. And I don't think people look at it this way. You know, you think of the foreign students that come to the United States, and some of them stay very brilliant people, and how much research is done at universities that is so beneficial for medical research, for industry, those sorts of things. And, you know, if you're not adequately educating your populace, then what you're doing is being detrimental to future workers. You're stymieing our talent, you're stymieing our creativity, and in doing so, you are, affecting our nation in a negative way. And, you know, I think to cut funding for education, it's so short-sighted. It's this immediate thing, but they don't understand how it's going to be harmful on down the line for everybody, you know.
Dennis is an educator. He's spent his career in education, so he knows whereof he speaks. And right now, we've had some conversations with the local school superintendent. His state funds are reduced, and he doesn't exactly know what's going to happen over the foreseeable future.
It's and I don't know if this is actually going to happen, but there's a good chance that 20 teachers in this district will be laid off. And, you know, from what I hear, it will be down towards the elementary level. Now, that affects a lot of things, because if you have larger class sizes, you cannot be as effective. You know, if they're cutting funding, you know, I think we talked about their teachers already have to buy their materials that they're using for class, you know. I've seen it all along, you know, through my career and stuff, how people provided for their own classrooms and things because they had to meet the shortcomings that just wasn't there, you know. And you're taking opportunities away from a child's future.
And this compares and contrasts with, for example, financing a $600 million stadium for the Cleveland Browns. Rich guy. It's disgusting. All right, I want to move on to something which perhaps the Democrats take a little hit on, and that is the way we're thought about our attitudes toward the police and police officers. It's true, after a police officer murdered George Floyd, a few Democrats uttered what I consider to be the single dumbest slogan ever, which was defund the police. The last thing the people of this country want is to defund the police. So that was not wise. The creed highlights both teachers and police officers, and we're talking about teachers. Educators and law enforcement officers should be held in high esteem, well paid, stringently selected, meet exacting standards of professionalism, ethics, and psychological motivation. Tom, what do you think about National Guardsmen being sent to American cities?
The National Guard is, if it's deployed on U.S. soil, those deployments normally are in response to an emergency of some sort. Usually natural emergency, such as a flooding or fires and that sort of thing. To respond, or sometimes even to respond to large amounts of civil unrest. But we haven't seen that in a while, until now. The thing is, they are there to help the people that they live with. They're there to provide support in times of crisis within their state. They are not there to be police officers.
I think that the federal law enforcement officers that have been sent to the cities can actually do some good. That would be the FBI and folks like that are assisting, I believe, with, I was talking about controlled drug buys. I think they're assisting with that kind of operation. However, doing that calls them away from their other duties, which may be, for example, to monitor domestic terrorist organizations, that sort of thing. And I want to comment that the National Guard, being called to help police cities, I don't think a National Guardsman is trained how to write out a ticket. I don't think they have any training whatsoever in how to handle testimony in a courtroom in a criminal case. These people are trained to destroy the enemy when they have to meet the enemy. And it's just a different thing. And they come into these cities with all their vehicles and they will stride around in uniforms. There may be some places in cities where it might be helpful to have somebody walking around, but that's not what happens in Washington, D.C. at least. I believe these National Guardsmen were put to picking up cigarette butts and whatnot in the parks.
Trash.
So the whole idea was just to show the uniform, show the equipment, show the armored personnel carriers as a kind of an intimidation factor.
And to normalize the idea of the military patrolling our streets.
One of the things that I want to bring up when you talk about law enforcement is we do not have a tradition of our law enforcement officers being masked. I mean, it may be on a very rare case or situation that you have SWAT teams, you have people like that. But to have an entire organization that is masked, has no identification on them, I mean, that is not an American way of doing things. If you go to Venezuela, you go to places like that, they have a secret police force, and those guys are masked constantly, and they operate outside the law as far as, what we believe should be your arrest rights, those sorts of things, and picking people up off the streets. That's not America. We don't do that. I have the utmost respect for policemen and law enforcement officers, but I think this is something extra. This is something beyond our police. I don't know if you agree or not.
Thank you, Dennis. I think that's yes. I always grew up with the idea that if you're subject to arrest by a police officer, you can say, well, officer, what's your badge number? I think you're making a mistake here. Who are you? You should be able to identify the person that's arresting you, and the person that's arresting you should have some authority for an arrest. I frankly do not know what a civil administrative arrest warrant is.
No.
I think it's something they use with unlawful immigrants. But on occasion, as I understand it, citizens are picked up, especially citizens that have brown skin and speak a little Spanish. That's constitutional violation, and we should understand that. All right. I think there's one last topic I'd like to touch upon with respect to the creed, and that is the creed states explicitly, or explanatory materials, American democracy depends on a nation that accepts and embraces diversity. Well, now, there you've touched upon a sensitive word, Tom. The word is diversity. Why would you use that word? Why wouldn't you shy away from that word and pick another word?
Because the reality is that we are a diverse nation. We always have been, and we always will be. Now, diversity is been made into a negative word by the people on the right, because to them, diversity is bad, because diversity means people who are not white male. because diversity includes, because it has to these days, white women as well as people of color, of people who come from different nations around the world, people who have different backgrounds, people who have different traditions than ours.
Not to mention Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists.
Diversity within religion as well. The thing is, when I was growing up, I used to hear the phrase "a melting pot." The United States was a melting pot, and at some point I read something where someone said, "Well, we're not a melting pot so much as we are this big, beautiful salad," because a melting pot kind of says, "Okay, we all it all melts together and just becomes one homogeneous thing." But in a salad, you're all mixed together, but you have all these wonderful flavors and textures and stuff throughout the salad that you're eating. So I like that analogy a lot better, because it is that diversity that in our backgrounds, that diversity in our talents, the diversity in life that makes us a strong nation. People bring from wherever they come from the ideas and the strengths of their own nations or their own backgrounds, and then they use that to build upon what we have here in the United States. It builds upon the United States. It doesn't tear it down. That is why diversity is so important, because diversity grows the United States and makes us stronger. It makes us more,
It's almost like it's hybrid vigor.
There you go.
Lots of different elements go into it, and it's stronger together than apart.
I think the current climate we have is all related in economy. You can always trace everything back to economics, I believe. And when an economy is not meeting the needs of everybody, but somebody's benefiting from it, those people that are benefiting from it want to say, hey, somebody that looks different than you, that acts different from you, they're the ones that are at fault for what's going on in our nation economically. And what a lot of people that follow along with that don't understand is that this thing has to keep going. It's like when you deport undocumented immigrants, and that doesn't make housing any more affordable, and you do this to another person, and that doesn't improve the economy anymore, then you've got to go on to another group. And people do not understand it does not just end with others. It can affect you. This thing feeds on itself is what it does. It has to. Because if it doesn't feed on itself, then it just kind of collapses within that whole premise is that we can keep things going this way, by blaming other people. And I think that's where we're at,
I think there's an example of that in the American South. During the Jim Crow period, the South was notorious as being economically backward. Yeah. And it wasn't until they got rid of Jim Crow, accepted blacks pretty much into the economy, that they started having much better economic success. I do want to point out one more thing, and going back to my meager military experience, I was fortunate enough to be appointed a chaplain assistant. And I noticed a couple of things in the Army. I still remember that. I think the Army was one of the best educators, from my perspective, that there is. But in the Army, first of all, a black man could do well. Ever since President Truman integrated the armed forces, and when I went in late 60s, early 70s, black men did well in the Army. There was no discrimination in rank, for example. Lots of black sergeants, my company commander in my basic training unit was, captain was a black gentleman. Also, in the chaplain assistant how I was required to do my job, I was trained to help with Protestant services. I was trained to help with Catholic services, but it didn't stop there. I was trained to help with Jewish services and Muslim services, because the United States Army was required to provide access to religious services for everybody in the Army, which included Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, atheists. And I think sometimes we ought to think about the way they did things a little bit that worked. And I think that particular part of the military back then worked well, and I've always remembered it, and I've always been grateful for the experience of having learned that. Clock on the wall is about 45 minutes, is about right. Do you have any concluding remarks, Dennis?
Yeah, I think that the creed is good, because if you don't define yourself, if you don't say who you are, then other people are going to say who you are. And they're going to tell everybody else, this is who they are. When we need a way of telling people, this is us, you know, because you just cannot sit back and not define yourself.
Especially these days.
Yes,
I think
these days,
with the Charlie Kirk rebound here, we're going to find more and more that Republicans and right-wingers are going to say there's something morally deficient with us. I don't think there's any reason for it. I'm not aware of a shred of evidence, for example, that this alleged assassin was a Democrat. But that doesn't make any difference. It's the Democrats that get the blame. So as you say, having a creed, having the ability to say this is what we believe in.
Yeah, that's been a big mistake with us. We've let other people control the narrative, you know, about what this stands for, you know, and that's been a big mistake.
I think that's a good comment. Thank you, Dennis.
And,
Tom?
you know, one of the things a couple of things I'd like to point out about the creed is that, the Democratic creed has been adopted by, I think, at this point, over 100 county, Democratic county parties and other organizations, with adoptees in 18 states and continuing to grow. And that includes county parties in places like Florida and Texas and out in California. So it is an idea that is growing. And for us, we are all that work on this at Democrats 101. We are all, including Jim, the author, volunteers. And most of the money that gets spent on it comes out of our pockets because we believe in this so much. And one of the things I will say is that the people that tend to get it the most are people that are in the rural areas or marginalized people, because those are the ones that feel like the Democratic Party has walked away from them. And so they read this and they say, yes, this resonates with them. We have found at this point so far, it doesn't resonate so much with urban Democrats because they don't and have not felt the pressures that rural Democrats have felt as our numbers have dwindled. So it resonates, more with rural Democrats than urban ones, but we are working to change that because this is something that should bring together the rural and the urban Democrats. This is what we need to tie people together, to have one foundation that we all stand on. Because it doesn't matter if we're rural or urban or suburban or anything else. What matters is that we are there fighting for the best of our country and fighting together for it.
Yeah.
And the last thing is that the ultimate goal, according to Democrats 101, is a just society as long as it takes.
Thank you, Tom. Viewers, what we have is an effort to explain what the Democrats are about and explain the principles which underlie the various policies that we may debate. So thank you for your time, gentlemen, and that should be it.